The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
This is a reading from the Good News according to Luke.
Glory to you.
Jesus went through one town and village after another, teaching as he made his way to Jerusalem. Someone asked him, "Lord, will only a few be saved?" Jesus said to them, "Strive to enter through the narrow door, for many, I tell you, will try to enter and will not be able." When once the owner of the house had got up and shut the door, and you begin to stand outside and to knock at the door saying, "Lord, open to us," then in reply he will say to you, "I do not know where you come from." Then you will begin to say, "We ate and drank with you and you taught in our streets." But the Lord will say, "I do not know where you come from. Go away from me, all you evildoers." There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth when you see Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all the prophets in the kingdom of God, and you yourselves thrown out. Then people will come from east and west, from north and south, and will eat in the kingdom of God. Indeed, some of the last who will be first, and some are first who will be last. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Yesterday was August the 20th, and it was a significant day in Sydney's history, although it's been rather forgotten now by us, by the press, by the media. 165 years ago, Sydney residents woke up to the news of a state-of-the-art sailing ship named the Dunbar was approaching Sydney Heads, and in a giant storm hit the sandstone cliffs of South Head near the Gap. 122 children, women, men, all their belongings were picked up, were drowned. Their bodies and their belongings were picked out of the harbour for days later. It was a very grisly moment that really embedded itself in the minds and imaginations of those people 165 years ago. I guess we've forgotten it now. But to get a sense of the dimension of it, it would be rather like a big jumbo jet, a Boeing jumbo jet, crashing into Botany Bay just on trying to land at Kingsford Smith. The only difference was that in those days, 165 years ago, there were 57,000 people living in the city. So it was tiny in compared to today. When the funerals of those who were taken out of the sea happened in Southhead Cemetery, 20,000 people attended the funeral. A third of the city. So yesterday, why I'm telling you about this, a little group of us commemorated it yesterday out at Watson's Bay. And I must say I was drawn into the story in a way that I've never been drawn in before. There was one person saved from the Dunbar, and he clung on to the rock shelf just below the Gap, and his name was Johnson, and he tells the story of just what happened on that fateful night of August the 20th, 1858. The gospel, of course, raises a question. Who will be saved? What does salvation mean? Well, they're huge questions, by the way, and I'm going to not try to bite into them in any sort of depth because we'll be here till next Wednesday week. The whole question of salvation was one of the great debating points during the Reformation, and particularly during the plague that really enveloped Europe for, well, over 100 years, in which life was cheap and people didn't realise whether they were going to catch the plague or not. Familiar? Yeah, very familiar today in epidemic times. So the idea of salvation and the fear of death really shaped our thinking as a church. But something else happened, and I'd like to go back to the scriptures and the significance of boats. Just a little bit of information about the Gospels and about the scriptures generally. The boats have always been part of our biblical story. Well, Noah's Ark, for a start. Noah's Ark is an image, a metaphor of people being saved from the great flood. Later on in the Gospels, Jesus seemed to be always in a boat. He was always crisscrossing the Lake of Galilee. He preached from a boat. He called Simon and Andrew away from their boats. He was asleep in the boat when it hit a storm. After Calvary and the resurrection, Peter went back to his boat on the Lake of Galilee as a fisherman. So there's a nice little image of boats and how significant boats are that run right through our scriptures. To go back to Noah's Ark and salvation, it wasn't just people who were saved. It was animals, wasn't it? The whole idea of salvation was not just an individual human thing. It embraced the animal life of our planet. And that sounds very, very contemporary. Paul, in one of his letters, has a phrase, a tantalising phrase. He says, the whole creation was groaning for redemption. The whole planet, the inanimate planet, the whole home in which we reside on this beautiful little fragile planet of ours. And Paul said it was groaning for redemption. That expands the idea of salvation even wider than animals and people. It goes to the salvation of the entire planet. Again, something that we're thinking about very seriously at the moment. But the thing that I'd like to emphasise at the moment is how important boats were in terms of salvation. So important were they that they began to build churches like boats. If you like to look up at that ceiling there, that's wooden. And although it may not look like the bottom of a boat, that's actually what the architect's mind was when he designed this church. A church is an upside-down boat. We call this the sanctuary of the church, and we call that part the nave. And the word nave comes from the Latin word navis, which means boat. So the architectural form of churches are that they are boats, they are Noah's Ark, they are places where we come to try to taste and reflect upon this important idea of salvation. Complicated, isn't it? But that's a theme that runs through the history and ideas of that. Of course, it's a bit confused today because the church is in such a terrible mess. We're struggling with communicating to young people. We're struggling with a sense of equity and equality between women and men in our church. We've been disgraced by pedophilia and sexual abuse among many of the ministers of the church. We haven't gone out to the victims of pedophilia in the way that leaves us feeling very proud. The church is a very, very ambiguous place. I like to think of it like a leaking boat. That we promise salvation, but we're wrestling with very, very serious issues. So I'm going to leave you with those confusing thoughts, a little bit of poetry. When I get confused, I turn to the poets. And there's a poet that you're familiar with, and well, some of you may be familiar with, who was a favourite poet of mine. Her name is Mary Oliver. Mary and I are contemporaries, by the way. She's dead and I'm alive, but anyway, we were born about the same time. She's a lovely poet, an American, has a lovely sense of this world. Her sort of searching for faith within an institutional church is central to her life. But this poem is about a boat, and I'd like to read it to you. It'll take a minute or so. The poem is called If I Wanted a Boat. And these are the words. I would want a boat, if I wanted a boat, that bounded hard on the waves, that didn't know starboard from port, and wouldn't learn, that welcomed dolphins and headed straight for whales, that when rocks were close would slide in for a touch or two, that wouldn't keep land in sight, and when fast and